Good morning. My name's Andrew. Let me welcome you to Grace Church this morning. If you are visiting us this morning, or if you've been coming for a while and you're getting used to the idea of online church, we're continuing and finishing our series today based on the book by Jen Wilkins, None Like Him, looking at how God is not like us and how we can see the attributes of God and learn from that. And this morning I've got the privilege of finishing the series looking at the sovereignty of God. And we're going to look through that this morning and dig into that. But I thought I'd start with a story. So I've only recently moved to this area in the last few years. So I've come down from London. And I've got to the point where I've realised you have very different wildlife down here. I'm used to seeing sparrows and pigeons and blackbirds. But very soon after we'd moved, I realised that you've got lots of birds of prey here. And for someone who's not used to that, I was fascinated. I'd be driving along and I would see in the corner of my eye something that doesn't look anything like I've seen before, just hovering there. It's got to the point that my wife constantly tells me when I'm driving, Andrew, look at the road, because I'm just, in a different world. And I'm fascinated by these different creatures. I've started to look at some of the facts that go alongside them, how they can speed down at high speeds, 150 miles an hour to catch their prey, how their eyesight is 8 times better than ours. Some amazing stats about these creatures. And I was walking the other day on the Trundle with the family, first time we've been there, and we got to the top and the views were amazing. You can see all the way down to the sea, and you look all the other way to the South Downs, and I start to see these birds kind of hovering around and flying up. And I start showing my wife, Julie, I say, look at these birds. Don't you think they're amazing? And telling her about the facts. And she was as well, started to be absorbed by them. These massive red kites just hovering. And it's a bit like this morning. We've come to this series and we're studying some of the attributes of God. And we're learning bits about him and becoming absorbed with him. I wonder this morning whether you have been absorbed over the last 6 weeks or so with who God is. Or have you buried your head down before and you've not really known who God is, and it's just a 3-letter word that you just pass off? Well, as we come to the end of this series, maybe it's time to start looking up to who God is and to some of his attributes. Let's not be like those people that walk with heads down, that ignore this amazing wildlife above our heads. Granted, I might gather you're not into birds as much as I am, but still, God is amazing. And so we've been looking at his different attributes over the last few weeks, his self-sufficiency, how he's infinite, how he's omnipresent, he's with us all the time, how he's unchanging. And this morning, we're coming to this topic of God being sovereign. And it's been based around this passage of Psalm 27, verse 4, which says, "One thing I ask of the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and seek him in his temple." To gaze, to spend time looking at him, to be absorbed by him. Not just a quick flick through and learning a few words about, yes, omni means this, or whatever it would be, but really to gaze and to sit at his feet and to be encouraged and strengthened as a Christian. As we started this series, I got the privilege to read the book, and I'm not very good at reading books, but given the fact you're going to be preaching on the topic, you should probably read the book. So I've read the book, and even from the get-go, I was really drawn into how this topic and studying can help to unburden us. How freeing it is when we're studying God in all his awesomeness, and how that releases us. It takes the pressure off. We don't need to control everything. We don't need to have all the answers. We don't need to know everything. We can trust in a God who is unchanging, who is self-sufficient, infinite, worthy of our praise this morning. So, the sovereignty of God. Bit of a funny word. So a simple definition for this might be, because it's not something we normally use in our language nowadays, it would be God as the supreme authority whereby all things are under his control. It kind of goes hand in hand with his omnipotence, which really means his infinite power. He is powerful. He is not just a little bit powerful, he's infinitely powerful. And so we've got God who is over everything, who controls everything, but is also powerful and has the power to enact his will. A sovereign is a word we sometimes use with our monarchy. The Queen is our sovereign. Track back maybe a couple of 100 years ago to Queen Victoria. This might help to understand what it is to be sovereign. She was the Queen of the British Empire, which in her time expanded to the point that the sun would never set on this kingdom. This empire was so vast, and she controlled it. Even though she was not there, she was in England, she had the power and the authority to control her kingdom. And that's like it with God. God controls, and he is the author, and he is in control of everything that's going on in this kingdom. Funny thing, when our new queen, Queen Elizabeth, was going through her coronation, they present her with this funny thing, this little globe with a cross called an orb. Something sounds like from Lord of the Rings, but it's an orb. And the Archbishop of Canterbury gives it to her and says, "Receive this orb set under the cross, and remember," this is to the Queen, "that the whole world is subject to the power and empire of Christ, our Redeemer." Even at the height of coronation of this Queen who's about to inherit a kingdom and an empire which the sun doesn't set on, she's being reminded, just remember, you are beneath Christ, whereby everything is subject to him, even you. And this morning, that is an encouragement for us. I'm going to go through some Bible passages just to illustrate, in a sense, how God is in control. So there's about 5 or 6 passages. You might find these helpful to memorize yourself. Some of them you probably already know. Romans 8 verses 28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for their good, for those who are according to their purposes." We know that if we love God, he's working all things together for our good. Not just some things, not just at some times, not just in the good times, but he's working all things together for our good. How encouraging is that to hear this morning, that he is working all things together for our good? Ephesians 1 verse 11 says, "In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things," again that word, all things, "according to the counsel of his will." And you know what? God is interested in the smallest things in our lives. Matthew 10 verse 29 says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground except by my Father? But even the hairs on your heads are numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than sparrows." He knows more about you than you actually know yourself. He knows the number of hairs on your head. Mine are diminishing with age. There is still a few there that I can count, but he knows deep down more about myself than probably I know myself or my wife or my kids. He knows us. He cares for us. And in that, he is working all things together for our good. Colossians 1 verse 16 says, For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, because he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's holding it all together. He's got it all in control. He is sovereign over it all. And he is also not just sovereign, he is the King of kings. He is the sovereign of sovereigns. It says in Revelation that on his robe and on his thigh is the name written, King of kings and Lord of lords. He even says it of himself in Matthew 28 verse 18, All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. He's not just got the power, but he has that authority as well. So much so that just a bit later in that chapter in Matthew 28, verse 27, the disciples who see him commanding the winds and the waves to quiet says, "Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him?" He's in control of it all. He can speak to the wind and speak to the waves and say, "Quiet," and they listen. This is an awesome God that we serve and that we know. I love this quote by Abraham Kuyper, who I think is probably dead. It's probably used quite a lot, but it says, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.' It is his. He is sovereign over everything that is happening, and he is upholding it by the power of his word." In Hebrews, it says that he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the power of his word. He just keeps speaking it into existence. He keeps speaking it to continue. He is upholding it. He is sovereign over it all. So what do you need to hear this morning about God's sovereignty? He is in control. Let me say it again. What do we need to know about God's sovereignty this morning? He is in control. Might not feel it. Things may have started to spiral for you where you're losing control, lost your footing in life. There is no situation, no circumstance, no turn of events where God has lost his control and lost his sovereignty over a situation. He controls it. This season that we've been through, been craving for control, the whole COVID thing has thrown us completely. You think 6 months ago, we had things, or we believe we had things under control, and now we're in a situation where we've got through, to be honest, maybe the worst of it, but there's still so many unknowns, and we're craving for our government to take control of a situation. Maybe they can't. Maybe kids won't go back to school. Maybe things won't go back to how they are. There's a lot of unknowns because ultimately governments don't hold ultimate control. They're not sovereign. Now, I don't say that just to make you anxious, but I say it in a sense to make you realize that our trust shouldn't be in a government. It should be in God, who is sovereign. He won't fail. We learnt about it. He's unchanging. He can't suddenly become a cropper. Many of you will have grown up and not experienced events like this where governments are losing control of situations and nations are being shaken, but many of you are. We're quite privileged in the sense in this Western world that, especially in my lifetime, I've never experienced turmoil or change as much as we are now. But others of you are coming from different countries and backgrounds where, yes, you've been through great trials and difficulties, and countries and governments have been upturned. For us this morning, it's encouraging to know that God is in control through the good and the bad. It only takes a small adjustment in your life to realize you don't have control. Be it a sickness, be it a bill that comes in you didn't quite realize was going to happen. Be it your job just suddenly stops, a contract finishes and is not renewed. It doesn't take a lot to start to destabilize things that we've put a lot of trust in our life. And I'd like to look at a story this morning in the Old Testament of a chap called Saul becoming king. When we were planning and I was looking at kind of what to speak on, I was immediately led to this passage because I felt it was something that God wanted to speak to us about. So 1 Samuel 8, verses 1 to 8. Israel demands a king. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are also doing to you." This turmoil comes about. Maybe the people of Israel, quite rightly, they've seen these judges, people are supposed to be kind of, looking out for them, are really just corrupt. But what they do is they don't go to God in prayer. They don't seek God. They come up with their own plan and think, let's just get a king. Let's be like the other nations. But God's saying, I am your king. I am the sovereign. I'm in control. Seek me. And he tells Samuel, warn them. Tell them that if you go for a king, it's not going to be great. He'll enslave you. He'll take your sons and get them to work for him. You'll have to pay him. There's going to be all these extra bits that come about that they may not realize. So Samuel does that, and then we pick the story up of the people's response in verse 19. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king for us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Seems like such a superficial story, but really what's going on there is a couple of things where they're in a sense removing God from the equation. And so I want to look at 4 ways in which we can sometimes do that ourselves when we take our sovereign God and remove him from the equation, sometimes willingly, sometimes unwillingly. I think a lot of them really stem from this idea that we've lost the idea of the sovereignty of God being in control. In a sense, the first one they did is they exchanged God for a king. They kind of abdicated that glorious sovereignty that God held over them. They tried to be like the other countries and assimilate and copy. They let fear in. They got anxious about the situation. They're probably worried about the defense of their borders and thought, look, we need something. Look, these other countries, they've got kings. It might be this morning that maybe your finances have really taken a bad hit over the last few months. And you're thinking, what shall I do? And you're trying to kind of get through a period which is quite difficult. Or maybe it's, tithing. You've got friends who are in the world that are saying, why would you tithe in a pandemic? Why give your money away? Well, you know what? Tithing is a great way of an act of faith, even in times of difficulty. It's really saying, God, you're sovereign over my finances, and I trust not in the money that I get in each month. I'm trusting in you. Maybe we need to be challenged on that this morning. I guess one of the ways we respond is how the people didn't. They didn't go to God in prayer. We see Samuel responding quite quickly. God, what should I do? He's into the presence of God in prayer. And the people didn't do that. They've kind of come up with their own idea. I tell you, every time I pray, I'm reaffirming the sovereignty of God in my life, because I'm saying, I can't do this. I've got limits, but God, you're in control. Would you step in? So maybe one of the things we need to do this morning, if we're going through these tough times, is let's take it to God in prayer. Let's take it to him who is sovereign over these situations. Another way that the people may have rejected the sovereignty of God is by overthrowing and, in a sense, rejecting God. They kind of knew the right path to choose, but thought better of it. Maybe they got to the point where they thought, maybe God's not for us. Maybe he's left us. We need to start coming up with our own idea. They forgot the idea that God had led them out of Egypt, that he cared for them, that the story of the people in the wilderness was God still was providing for them. Maybe this morning it's you've got to the point where you kind of think, well, maybe God's forgotten me. Maybe this situation that I'm in is because God doesn't love me, or he's forgotten what I'm doing, or what I'm, whatever it would be, fill in the blanks. Well, this morning, God is still passionately for you, and he loves you deeply. And there might be tough times. Rather than throwing toys out the pram, rather than getting to the point where you're just saying, look, God doesn't love me, know the truth this morning. God loves you, but come to him, and he will be the one who will comfort you. He is the one that will be sovereign over those situations. Another way that is quite topical for our culture, how we kind of get rid of this sovereignty of God, is we have this stoical mantra of I did it my way. The famous, I think it's Frank Sinatra song, I did it my way. I won't sing it. I'll let Joe Leach do that. But, the idea of trying to go through life and just doing it in our own strength. They did well. These elders, they got together. They came up with a really good plan. They thought, let's do this. This is the right way to go. Tried to do it in their own strength. They were kind of looking for these earthly solutions to a heavenly problem. This was God's people. He wasn't about to just give up on them. It was coming to God was the first step that they didn't do. It doesn't rest on you this morning. This life, it's not just about all your effort and how much you can push through and achieve. Psalm 46 verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." He is in control. He's got it. He's sovereign. I'm constantly aware, even through this period, that I'm not fully in control of my life. I'm dependent on so many people for so many things. We think I've got it all tied together, but I tell you what, if the bin men go on strike, you'll soon start realizing how much you need people to help you run even just some of the basics in life. I found this the other day when we were down at the beach, and I've got 4 children, 6, 8, 2 and almost, 6, 8, 4 and almost 2. And we're in the sea, and I'm watching the 2 older boys there in the sea. One's the 6-year-old sat in a rubber ring, and the 8-year-old swimming away. And I'm like, I've got this under control. I'm a good dad. And suddenly a wave comes out of nowhere and takes out the 6-year-old. The 6-year-old flips over in his little donut. The rubber ring goes off. The 6-year-old, who can't really swim, is in water too deep. And I'm looking at this kid, potentially drowning, and suddenly I see my 8-year-old start swimming after a rubber ring which is floating out to sea further and further, and he can't swim really either. And then I suddenly realised I've got the baby on the beach. My wife's around. We can't leave the 2 little kids. Very quickly, a situation where I thought, I've got this. I'm in control, turned into complete discontrol, for want of a better word. We find situations like that all the time. I once had a really sad story of a patient who was diagnosed with cancer, but was so caught up in controlling his life and not letting his family in because he didn't want to burden them, didn't want them to be having to do things for him. He got to the point where he didn't tell them about his cancer diagnosis. And despite me saying, I think you should be telling them, he went through his life and went through treatment without telling them about his diagnosis. He tried to do it all on his own strength. It terrified him that the idea of losing control and the impact that would have on his family, to the extent that he didn't let them in. And this morning, there's going to be situations where we need to let God in. Let him in this morning. I think the final way is that we can sometimes respond in a way to God's sovereignty by forgetting and becoming passive, guessing that God's got it. It's not really anything for me to do. He'll sort it out. It's a bit like these people. They potentially had some of the most amazing experiences in their history where God had led them out of Egypt. He'd led the Israelites out of Egypt and, miracle after miracle, but they just kind of got to the point where got a bit passive and forgot. They'd drawn away from that. They've got a bit of a jaded kind of view of it. It was all just slowly kind of fading away, and the idea maybe God's in control, and in essence they might just be becoming a bit more passive. And I think that's sometimes the biggest risk when we talk about the sovereignty of God, is that we can fall into this delusion that God's in control. You know what? Maybe I don't need to do anything. He'll do it. He's in control. Even this morning, maybe I don't need to preach. I could just walk off. It's quite hot outside. God will do it. God will sort it out. The author of the book that we've been studying says this. She says, divine sovereignty and human responsibility are parallel truths. We must hold simultaneously. I fall into the error time and time again of just thinking a deductive way of thinking. Like, well, if God's sovereign, I'm not in control. Or if I'm in control, God's not sovereign. But the Bible quite happily puts those two concepts together, and it's quite happy to hold them without giving a real explanation. So we can't always entirely know how they really do line up, but we know that they do. And I'll go through a few Bible passages to help illustrate that. But a good explanation for this would be the idea of popcorn. You might be thinking, where does popcorn come to this? You have sweet popcorn and you have salty popcorn. You might have your favourite. It's sweet normally, but you can get these magical bags which have sweet and salty together. Now, I take a mouthful of popcorn, I say, oh, that tastes nice. And someone says to me, oh, what does it taste like? I say, it's sweet. They say, well, it can't be salty. I say, it's salty. I say, well, it can't be sweet. I say, well, it is salty and it's sweet. I say, well, that doesn't go together. But clearly we know it does, don't we? God's sovereignty and man's free will go together. We are accountable for the things that we do. The Bible illustrates that even from the start in Genesis, where God says to Adam and Eve, look, do what you like, eat in this garden, just don't eat of that tree. Very clear a choice that was set up for them. They had the opportunity to listen to God or to choose themselves. And so we are accountable for our actions. A great story in the Old Testament is Joseph that illustrates this. And it's in where is it? It's in Genesis 45, verses 4 to 8, that you can have a read through. But in essence, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers who really don't like him. You might not like your siblings, but you might not sell him into slavery. But Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. And we know the story of Joseph coming through, and he becomes this great leader in Egypt and helps save nations from famine, and he meets his brothers. And he says to the brothers who, on finding out who Joseph is, he says, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me father to Pharaoh and lord of this land. There's free will there, the brothers choosing to put Joseph into slavery, but God is at work there. And they still don't get it. And even still, later on in chapter 50, verse 20, they come again and Joseph says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive. The Bible's quite happy to hold those two together, that God is sovereign, but your actions matter. We see it in Jesus on the cross. Time magazine, a famous magazine, led with the story of who killed God, who killed Jesus. And it looked at all the different characters at play there, looked at Judas. Well, look, he betrayed Jesus. He gave the opportunity for the soldiers to take him. Then you've got the Jews who, they conspired against him and trumped up charges. They were, in a sense, responsible. And then you've got Herod and you've got Pilate who, gave the decree. You've got the soldiers there who were, the ones that physically enacted that will. But the Bible then says in Romans, it says, he who did not spare his own son but gave him up for us all, God did it. And Time magazine came to the conclusion it was God. God was sovereignly in control of that situation, even though people were for their evil doing things to crucify Jesus. God was still working through that situation. So we see the two truths again there. Who was in control? Whose action was it? Was it man's or was it God's? And we've got the two going together. So don't be passive this morning. When it comes to what God has called you to do, he says, you were chosen to tell about the excellent qualities of God who called you. That was in 1 Peter 2 verse 9. And I want to kind of finish in a sense of just giving you a chance to gaze upon God. We've kind of had a look a bit about God's sovereignty, about him being in control, standing in awe, gazing upon him who is able to do all things. Maybe God's speaking to you this morning and he's saying, look, don't assimilate, don't copy what others are doing in society, trying to solve situations that you are out of your depth with. Maybe the first thing is to come to him in prayer this morning. Maybe your finances are a bit all over the place and you're struggling and contracts aren't coming in yet. And God says, look, come before me. I'm sovereign over this situation. He doesn't want you to be striving to do things in your own strength. The first step is to come to him. I have a tendency to avoid praying at times because I get caught in this delusion of thinking, well, God's in control. Well, what does my prayer life add to that? But look, this morning we can see that we have our free choices and God is in control and he calls us on that journey with him. So maybe our prayer life does actually mean a lot more than we think it or thought it did. It says the Lord works all things together for those who love him. Maybe for you this morning, you're looking in and you've not really made a commitment to Jesus in the past. Well, look, this morning God would say, I can work all things together for your good. But there's a small little window there, a little caveat to say that it's for those who love him and put their trust in him. Maybe you want to pray that in your heart this morning, that you would get to the point of making a step of faith to him. I think it's quite easy to preach on the sovereignty of God when things are good, when everything seems like it's in control. Quite hard when maybe things in society have shifted massively as they have done. But God is as sovereign as he was in the good times as he is in the difficult times. He's sovereign this morning over your situation. He knows intricately what it is. He knows the number of hairs on your head. He's got it all. Maybe the response for us this morning is just to sit and gaze at his feet. There's a hymn that was revamped a bit called It Is Well With My Soul. And it has a line in it that says, the wind and the waves still know his name. This morning, God still knows your situation. The wind and the waves, the situations that we're in, they still respond and are under the control of our sovereign God. That's a glorious truth. Let me pray for you this morning as we finish, that you would experience maybe the transcendent truth that God has got you in the palm of his hand and that he's caring for you and he loves you. Father, I thank you that, Lord, even though things might not make sense, even though in this world things have destabilized in a way that we've lost control over things, Lord, I thank you that we stand firm on your character and your sovereignty. Lord, you are in control. I pray for everyone that's listening this morning, if they're going through periods where foundations they've been standing on have been shaken, that you would remind them that, Lord, you are sovereign over their situation, that you have the authority and the power over their situation. And I pray for people, if they need to start praying out and stepping out in trusting you, they would do that this morning. Lord, we thank you that you care for us. We can trust that you are sovereign, and we can trust in our sovereign God because we know that you are for us and you love us. Lord, I thank you for this series. I thank you that you have blessed us, that we have gazed upon who you are. I pray you bless us as a church as we move into a new season, knowing that, God, you are sovereign and in control. Amen.